In shipping, the most valuable commodity is not fuel, it's time. Time at sea, time at berth, time hanging around waiting for fuel, time waiting for a slot up the canal, time explaining to a customer why a voyage has slowed down, why a cargo has been rolled, why a vessel that was designed to move really quite fast is now being operated deliberately slowly because the fuel bill and the emissions bill have both become too painful. That is the starting point for civil, maritime, nuclear propulsion. A ship, it's not a floating moral statement. Ship owners don't say, my emissions are lower than yours, and gently polish their halo. It's a balance sheet moving across the ocean. It is capital, it is cargo, it's schedule integrity, and it's optionality. It's a promise to the customer that a thing will be in one place on one day and somewhere else on another day. For too long, the emissions conversation in shipping has asked ship owners to choose between this virtue and competitiveness. It has asked them to carry more fuel, slow down, accept uncertain fuel availability, absorb new infrastructure risk, and then call that progress. I don't think that's good enough. So the question before us is not whether shipping can become cleaner. It must. The question is whether shipping can become cleaner while also, and more importantly, becoming more competitive, more resilient, and more strategically useful to the countries and industries that depend on it. Because the real case for nuclear propulsion is that it changes the operating characteristics of the ship. It changes speed, it changes endurance, it changes cargo capacity, it changes routing, it changes exposure to fuel price volatility, it changes the strategic value of the fleet. And if we get the surrounding ecosystem right, it changes the competitiveness of maritime nations, and it can strengthen a nation's flag. So let me put it another way. The industry has spent years looking for a fuel that can behave like oil but be cleaner than oil. But why should ships remain dependent on fuel in the first place? The cheapest fuel is, after all, the one you do not have to keep buying. That line got quite a reaction at Posidonia recently because it speaks the language of shipping. The language of shipping is unfortunately not virtue. The language of shipping is economics. It is cold, hard cash and market positioning. Today, much of the industry response to increasing costs has been to slow steam. That's understandable. If fuel is expensive, you want to burn less. If emissions are penalised, you emit less. But slow steaming is not transforming. It's rationing. It rations speed. It rations asset productivity. It rations cargo velocity. It rations the value of the ship. A fleet designed to move global trade is being asked to compete by doing less of what it was actually built to do. That should make us pause. We all know that shipping carries the majority of the world's trade. If the industry loses speed, reliability, and flexibility, the effect of that is not only on ship owners, it is felt by consumers and industry. And it's also felt through energy security and national resilience. So we've learnt the hard way recently, and actually over the decades, that choke points really do matter. Suez matters, Panama matters, the Red Sea matters, port congestion matters, weather windows matter, canal restrictions, bunker availability, they all matter. a nuclear-powered commercial vessel doesn't make geography or indeed the weather disappear, but it gives the operator more options. More speed when speed matters, more endurance when endurance matters, more routing flexibility when the usual route is no longer the best route. This is why I believe that the first serious adopters will not be motivated only by emissions. No way. These guys, they're going to be motivated by performance, economics. They will ask, can I run the ship harder? Can I increase my annual cargo per hull? Can I reduce my exposure to fuel volatility? Can I improve my schedule reliability? Can I carry more revenue cargo because I'm not carrying the same volume of fuel? Can I serve my customers who value speed and certainty better? Can I keep operating when the rest of the system is constrained? These are questions of economics. They are the same questions the sector has been asking itself since the dawn of time. It drove containerization. It can drive the nuclear revolution. Core Power has identified more than 8,000 candidate vessels suitable for nuclear power. The addressable market is measured in the trillions of dollars. That does not mean that every vessel needs to be nuclear. It means the opportunity is large enough, serious enough, and commercial enough to drive practical deployment pathways. The first market will not be every ship everywhere all at once. That's not how these things work. The first market will be where the value of nuclear endurance, high utilization, and zero-emission operations is clearest. High energy demand, long asset life, predictable operating profiles, routes where reliability is valuable, vessel classes where fuel volume, refueling logistics, and speed all matter. The competitive edge is simply that the vessel can do more for longer. But let's be honest about the hard part. And it is the hard part that we spend a lot of our time thinking about and much of what we will discuss today. Because the hard part is, let's face it, not standing on a stage going, yay, isn't it a good idea? The hard part is making the first one, legally, commercially, and politically. And that means all of these things. It means class rules, flag state confidence, port state confidence, nuclear licensing interfaces, crew competence, and emergency planning, security, safeguards, liability, insurance, public trust. We have discussed many of these things today, and we will continue to do so, because this is where the debate needs to become practical. And I have no patience with the idea that regulation is merely a barrier and it somehow needs to be magically removed. That would not be good for the industry, because good regulation is a deployment asset. It turns an idea into an investable proposition. It tells insurers what risk they are underwriting. It tells ports what ships they are accepting. It tells governments what they are endorsing, and it tells ship owners what they can order. But regulatory silence is not neutrality, it is delay. So, if a country wants to remain a serious maritime nation, or perhaps become one again, it cannot wait for nuclear-powered ships just to appear at the pilot station going, hey, I'm here, give me a chat, drive me into port. That's not going to happen. We have to be absolutely clear that from the outset, who is responsible for saying yes? So the countries that move first will not be the countries that cut corners. They will be the countries that organize themselves early. They will bring the entire ecosystem and the industry into the same room to shape the sector of the future. That's why early pilot products projects and corridors are so important.
Yeah.
A corridor is a governance laboratory. It asks which flex state, which port state, which liability regime, which insurance structure, which emergency planning assumptions, etc., etc., etc. It might not get it right the first time, but by doing so, we will all learn, because it makes the abstract concrete, and it creates something that investors, people who are maybe not in this room today, something that they can understand. Because that matters, because capital will not finance enthusiasm. My goodness, I wish it could. Capital finances risk allocation. If the risk sits everywhere, the project goes nowhere. If the risk is understood, allocated, and backed by credible governments, then markets can move. So, what should we ask of government? First, stop treating maritime nuclear as a curiosity, because it's not. But I've been in government, and I know that something like maritime nuclear sits between a lot of departments, and that creates coordination problems. So, governments, join the dots. Create the organisational structure that pulls in from all of the relevant government departments. Second, designate responsible authorities and create assessment pathways. Someone, somewhere, needs to be able to say, what is the process to deployment? Third, support first-of-a-kind deployment. The first projects will need public-private risk sharing. And why should they? Well, because they create public goods. Regulatory learning, industrial capability, safety case maturity, and most importantly, public confidence. Fourth, work internationally now. Bilateral agreements, port-state understandings, and practical operating corridors will not appear by magic. And fifth, talk to the public in plain language. Do not hide behind acronyms. Explain the purpose, the safeguards, the responsibilities and the benefits. Essentially, be transparent. The prize is significant. In a world in which clean energy is no longer a constraint on trade, growth, or national security, a shipping industry that does not have to choose between compliance and competitiveness, a shipbuilding base capable of delivering complex nuclear systems in series, ports that become strategic energy hubs, vessels that can run faster, carry more, refuel far less often, and have zero-emission operations. And yes, there will be skeptics. Good. We need them. Skepticism is useful when it asks hard questions and forces us to come up with better answers. If we get this right, civil maritime nuclear propulsion will not be a compliance footnote. It will be the competitive edge in shipping. It will be the moment shipping stops asking how slowly it can afford to move and starts asking how fast, how cleanly, and how confidently it can move again. Thank you. Right, I've got an excellent panel here, and I'm going to be as challenging as possible. I will accept no long answers. They're all terrified, it's brilliant. Okay, to each of you first, and then I will come with some individual questions. In one sentence, let's highlight what is most likely to slow a nuclear-powered ship. Technology, class approval, nuclear regulation, liability, insurance, public trust, capital. What is the long pole here? What is the thing that is most likely to slow development? Paddy.
So me. Is the mic working?
Yep.
Okay. So running with your balance sheet point, I think it's the financing and the investing in it. And nobody's going to finance or invest in a project unless there's insurance. And that is going to require almost all of the other things on your list. So there's a degree of circularity, but ultimately behind it all, governments are going to need to step in and support it. So my final answer would be governments to be the backstop to all of those structures.
That's your final answer.
feel like I'm on a quiz show now, but
Yeah.
the final answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very good, very good. Okay, so we've locked him in. So I think we're going to hear this quite a bit. Quite a lot of this comes back to insurance. And it's just a heads up for where this is going. Kimberly.
I completely agree. Obviously, there's a lot of relationships between all of these, so it's hard to just pick one out. But as one of the nuclear lawyers on this panel, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the entire nuclear legal and regulatory infrastructure, because you can't proceed without that. And there's so much at play with the insurance, with liability, with public trust. All of that is built into the architecture of that legal framework. And if you don't have that, you just can't simply proceed. And it obviously requires governments being fully 100% on board with this.
Superb. Ian, what legal instrument would need to exist before a first international route could be viable?
So I think it's back to what Kimberly was just alluding to, the bilateral agreement that we've been talking about today. That, ultimately you're going to need the international law agreement in the bilateral agreement, and then you're going to need domestic law and regulation as well to implement that, and all of that's going to have to be harmonised across the different participating parties in the corridor to get the project off the ground. And of course, that bilateral agreement, not only does it facilitate insurance, finance, it also starts to build public trust, which we've spoken about today as well. Which is really, really significant.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up on that because I'm the chair. So some people are going to be sitting in the audience going, what are they talking about? What's a bilateral agreement and what's in it? So what are the most important things in this bilateral? So say there was one between the US and UK. Yeah. What would be in it?
Okay, so basically what you're looking to do is an international law agreement to perform the role of what's missing from the international conventions, nuclear law conventions at the moment. So you're looking to establish a legal relations between parties and regulatory obligations, or what they're going to make what they're going to pass in their law. So you're looking at the 3 S's that we've discussed today: safety, security, safeguards, but also liability, where all of those intersect. And then you're looking at the more practical elements as well, because this is nuclear law and it's shipping. So you go back to the Savannah agreements, for example, you'll see things around port entry, see things around emergency planning, inspections, who has the right to inspect where and when, those sort of issues. So we have got the precedents from the Savannah, but they were agreed before a lot of the current international law was adopted. So it's a question of going back on over those and reviewing and updating the structure of those to make sure they meet the present day needs for the project.
Very good. And so for those of you who are not familiar, the NS Savannah was a nuclear-powered ship which sailed the high seas in the 60s, and a number of bilateral agreements were made with the US government and various other nations. So despite the fact those agreements are really, really old, they give us a really interesting underpinning of, the sorts of things that we were just talking about. Spyros, we dove down there, and I didn't mean to, and I'm sorry. What do you think? What do you think is the most tricky thing? And you approach this from a class perspective.
Well, to me, public perception is quite important. It depends very much on the country and the specific pilot case you are looking at the different stakeholders. But I think whichever way you look at it, public perception will be always at the heart of it. The subject is systemic. That's a short answer.
That was a very good short answer.
Yeah.
I agree on the public perception. And there's some wonderful photographs of the NS Savannah when it was in Piraeus. And there's lots of people standing there taking photographs of it, which is lovely, but it basically just looks like any other ship. But, in those days, it really did have a very positive, when it arrived in port, people were quite excited by it.
Yes, and I think people know, for example, in my country, that from time to time we have even NATO warships and aircraft carriers close to the islands and they're nuclear, and people are used to the idea of it. But this doesn't happen everywhere, of course. So
Yeah, I agree, and that will have to be something that is done internationally.
Yes.
And again, we need to be sort of transparent. So jumping forward, so let's say it is it's 2035. And everything's in place. We've got a ship owner, we've got a ship, let's start, and we've got a ship owner, we've got cargo customer, we've got a route, we've got a reactor vendor. So we've got everything that is sort of on the industrial side. Kimberly, who still has to say yes before it sets sail?
My number one question is, do we have a framework in place? So is there a framework there in place for someone to say yes?
Yeah, and that is the issue, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's the number one issue. Do we have the framework in place? Presupposing that is, have we determined who the competent authority is within the government? Is this a nuclear issue that's operating in a maritime context such that the nuclear regulatory authorities have the lead hand in this? Or are we treating this as a maritime issue with a slight nuclear context associated with that? You already see the tensions that exist. We heard a little bit about it this morning when we had the Secretary General of the IMO, where I think we can all just understand that between the IMO and the IAEA, there is that inherent tension right now over who has ownership of the issue. And it still doesn't feel like we've answered that question over who the ultimate authority, who the ultimate ownership lies. Particularly for myself, just speaking personally, this is a nuclear issue, and I don't see how we can operate in a context where it's not the nuclear regulatory authority having the final decision. Operating in partnership, of course, with our maritime colleagues within the government sector, but ultimately you're going to have the nuclear regulatory authority be that person or that authority of last resort who's making that ultimate decision that says, yes, you can operate.
Yes, and of course in the US we are seeing some interesting movements from their regulators, where the NRC and the US Coast Guard, who are the two relevant regulators, are about to refresh their MOU, which I think is coming out next week. And I think that will be helpful, and we need other nations to start doing that, and then those things need to start sort of talking to each other in order to make it hopefully all fit together.
But that also leads to another part when I talked earlier about the legal and regulatory infrastructure, is ensuring that you have a competent regulatory authority in the country. And the countries that are going to be dealing with maritime nuclear activities may not already have a competent nuclear regulatory body. And it takes time and resources to ensure that you have that. So you're developing an entirely new workforce in a lot of countries, and ensuring that we have the resources to do that, both from a human and financial perspective, is an incredible challenge on top of all of the other issues at play.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And the situation would be that, for example, a US ship with a US reactor would be licensed by the US regulator, by the NRC. Now, the NRC is an extraordinarily capable regulator, and I think many nations would take comfort from that. And I think for those of you who are not following this, I'm trying to make it quite simple, is that if you have a US reactor licensed in the US, it would also have to have the US flag, and therefore the rules of the flag rules would also then apply to the ship. So actually that is not necessarily obviously what happens now for other ships. As we were saying earlier, they can pick and choose as to where they're flagged, and there will be none of that, because obviously we need to make sure that if a ship has a license from a nation, it also benefits from the wider regulatory framework from that. So my question is, actually, here's a question to all of you, because I think this is quite an interesting point. To what extent does a third-party nation have to have a fully competent nuclear regulator, or to what extent could we accept third-party nations to look at the NRC and say, right, you said it's all right, it's got a US flag, looks pretty kosher, it's got all its paperwork, it's got a very competent crew. Do we think third-party nations in those instances would say, come into my ports? What do you think, Paddy?
Well, I think it's probably one for the nuclear team. My understanding is that but I'll answer it. But I think the IAEA would want to see the competent authority, and they wouldn't be happy for that authority to simply piggyback. They'd need to see some competence. There's a maritime person learning about nuclear. That's my understanding, the way they'd see it. Is that do you guys agree?
Okay, so how competent is competent?
So nuclear safety is a sovereign responsibility.
It is.
So there has to be a core level of competence within the country. So there has to be a regulator that at least is capable of assessing that the design they're accepting is safe. And this is from the current framework, which doesn't strictly apply to ships, okay? So that's a caveat. But that's one of the guardrails I think we're going to have to stay within. So there's a lot of talk about this for SMRs at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, if we license an SMR in the US, why can't we just go and take the license and literally just, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about how we harmonize the different regulatory regimes. So it's the same point. You're going to need a base level of competence to assess the license and also to assess whether it's going to be, in the way it's going to be deployed within your state, is safe. Because that is part, how you operate it, where it is, what hazards are around it, obviously goes to the safety of the operation of that.
Yeah.
So the answer is you will need a nuclear regulator. It won't need to look like the NRC necessarily.
Okay, no, that's really interesting. So that's something else that we, clearly will need to think about. And the next session is actually talking about the Rotterdam study, and part of that was talking about the Netherlands and their national regulator, etc. So it is something that we will have to bear in mind. Spyros, do you have any thoughts around this?
I would say that there are two steps in the process. The one is the approval of the nuclear reactor and then the integration of this nuclear reactor on a ship. And there are regulations and requirements in both states that are very important. So what I would say is that there has to be a harmonization between the requirements of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the local country Atomic Energy Authority. And there has to be harmonization between the local Atomic Energy Authority and the Ministry of Mercantile Marine of the country, and then eventually the IMO requirements. So there are different steps in achieving this, and even a third country would have to comply with that to maintain a nuclear fleet.
Okay, so you and I were at Posidonia recently, and we heard the Greek Prime Minister say that Greece is open to nuclear-powered ships, which was a very welcome statement. So do you think the Greek government, for example, just picking out one country at random, do you think that they're getting ready to think about how they're going to accept nuclear-powered ships?
I don't know if they're getting ready. I mean, this is something for the Prime Minister to answer, but what I can say is that Greece would be categorized as a nuclear-eager country, according to the IAEA requirements. So that's the correct acronym for it. What we did in the study we presented in Posidonia, also in association with Core Power, was to highlight a 15-year roadmap that can enable the opportunity to accommodate for nuclear ships in the Greek fleet, which is one of the biggest fleets of merchant ships in the world.
Yeah.
And as part of that, a few months ago, the Prime Minister, at an event in France, he highlighted that he's willing to discuss the idea of considering nuclear in maritime for Greece. And for this, you need an interministerial committee to start with. We will see what are the next steps.
So we haven't got one yet then in Greece, but we'll get one.
Maybe.
Maybe, okay.
What can I say?
You're sitting on the fence there, that's lovely.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So let's talk about this corridor stroke framework thing. And I hope you're not all going to agree, but let's see. Can we do it does a single corridor work? Do we need 3 countries, 4 countries? Do we need all countries? What's our starting point and why should it be that? Ian?
I think initially there's an argument for keeping it as simple as possible. So two 2 states with established nuclear regulators and established maritime heritage. Keep it small, keep it specific, then it's easy to deal with the what, when, who, where questions, and build from there. This is not at the expense of a more traditional multilateral convention. That's got to come, and that's the good work that's going to be done. But as we said earlier, that could take decades. It could take a long time.
Okay.
So we cannot wait for that. So build stepping stones. Start simple.
Okay, start simple. That's good. Paddy, if we start simple, will the insurers be happy?
I think we have to be pragmatic. As I say, everything is kind of connected. And I think that there will likely be a difference between the first of class and the nth of class, if you like. So from an insurance point of view, we really want to have as much certainty as possible. Legal certainty, so that goes to a convention, which isn't going to be in place in time for the first movers. So the fallback would be bilateral agreements, contracts, and probably some government backing to fill the gaps that might be in place. So I'm conscious I'm not the only lawyer on the stage, but the sort of thing we worry about, if we had just 2 countries who are a party to it, those parties might agree how to deal with the limits of liability, but somebody could easily bring a claim in a third country, or there could be a genuine issue in a third country along the route, to which we may not have the protection. That's the sort of thing that makes liability insurers like me nervous, and that's the sort of area where one would look to the kind of government part of the bilateral agreement to give us the sort of support. So, yes, in theory, everything is insurable, but the devil is in the detail, and it's the reason why my answer to the first question is governments, because to get it moving, there's going to need to be that first mover support.
Okay, talk to me a bit about governments and acting as backstop in a liability situation. So what do you want the government to actually do? And what does it do, for example, on land-based reactors now?
Well, Ian and I were talking about, so why don't I defer to the nuclear guys to talk about how they do with the land-based reactors, and then I can talk about maritime.
So the liability regime at the moment, requires that there are different liability conventions, but they typically require or impose a limit of liability on operators, and they require operators to have insurance up to that limit of liability with very few exceptions.
And then if there's a claim that's bigger than that, the government steps in.
Essentially, the government performs a role of insurer of last resort. Yeah. But it's not written down in the law. But it's an accepted position. It happened at Fukushima. Essentially the government stands behind the operator with an open checkbook.
It's essentially a policy decision by the government allowing nuclear to go forward.
Yeah.
And the government also performs a role where insurance isn't available for those mandatory limits. It'll step in and indemnify operators for the same liability. And it also indemnifies or guarantees for unchanneled liabilities in certain circumstances, although that's increasingly rare. So the whole thing about the nuclear liability regime is it channels liability to the operator. So there are some instances, Paddy mentioned one, because it's all done by international law. If a claim is brought in a court that isn't within the jurisdiction of that international agreement, you could face a claim outside the regime. Wouldn't be channeled to the operator. It could be unlimited, and that's where the government steps in to cover those claims.
Okay. Paddy, I'm not going to come back to you just yet now. I just want to talk to Spyros a bit. I need to get away from legal speak for a moment.
Yes,
that's
sure.
Okay. Right. Class.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? If there was a bilateral agreement, do you think you could come up with some rules and support the industry?
Well, the rules and the regulatory pathway, they have to be in place anyway. So the bilateral agreement is what enables to pick the dots of the interface between the class and the other regulators, the national authorities, the coastal states, to make this work in a practical fashion.
So I sort of see class sitting between the industry and the regulators. Is that a fair reflection, or?
I think class is fundamental in terms of assurance and safety standards, whereas insurance does what we realize in terms of risk. But irrespective to this, it is very important for all different stakeholders to have an agreed top-level roadmap that highlights what is that common technical language on the basis of which we should understand the risk. And we should have also a coordinated approvals roadmap considering both insurance and assurance issues. And this is going to give more confidence both to the ship owners, the end customer, and also the financing body for a project.
It always comes back to the money,
Yes.
indeed. Right, so this is audience participation time. You've heard my panel. There are lots of lawyers, so you don't have to agree with them. That's okay. So this is going to be a question. So you've got three options. So what do you think is going to be the biggest blocker or most difficult challenge for getting these ships on the water? Is it going to be 1, regulation, 2, insurance, 3, public acceptance? Okay, you need to think about that. Regulation, insurance, public acceptance. You have to pick one. Who's on regulation? Whoa. Who's on insurance? Really? Okay. And who's on public acceptance? Interesting. All right. I would say that was regulation first, then public acceptance, and then insurance. I did say that everything depends on insurance, but anyway. Okay. You didn't get the cue. Right, okay. Well, that's very interesting. So I thought I'd wake you up a bit, because what I need you to do now is also to think about what questions you want to ask. But before we do that, let's just have one more thought. So whilst we can, with Paddy, whilst you're thinking of questions, Paddy. What? No, this is no. You're not getting off the stage that quickly.
I didn't want to.
No, this is your. So we're going back to what is the one or couple of actions that need to happen in the next 12 months in your world, and who needs to help you do them?
I'm going to choose two areas.
Go.
So, as I say, for insurers, what we really want is certainty. So we want kind of legal certainty. We're not going to probably get that within 12 months, but we need those discussions to start to take shape. Some of that is about things that are outside our control, kind of bilateral agreements, contracts, and things that the insurers are not involved with, but we need the insurers to be talking to one another, and good news is we're starting to do that.
How is that happening?
So I'm here representing the UK P&I Club. For those coming from the nuclear side of things, there are 12 P&I clubs. We insure maritime liabilities. There are 12 such P&I clubs represented in the international group, which together insure basically all the world ships outside the shadow fleet. We've established a nuclear committee, which I happen to chair, and there are some other representatives from that committee here in the room, looking at all the things that need to be addressed for us should we choose to remove the current nuclear exclusion. I should be clear, because it hasn't come out in the discussion, that people were kind of content that the insurance will be sorted. At the moment, there is an exclusion for maritime liability insurance, which is common across all of the international group clubs and the pool through which they share risks. So that is a hurdle that needs to be overcome. And it's not a small hurdle, it's a hurdle that's exclusive to nuclear. We don't have that exclusion in place elsewhere. So I can't unilaterally do that as one club. It would need to be all clubs looking at how we might structure the insurance and whether we would run that through the international group pool. But we are meeting with the nuclear insurers and the nuclear pools next week. They have a maritime working group, which is the reflection of our nuclear committee, and we're getting together for a kick-off meeting to start say, how might we structure this in the future? So that's my sort of tangible thing on the kind of the legal side of it. How are we going to structure it's going to flow and then you gave me two. The other one is a technical understanding, because there's a lot of technical details starting to come out, but we need to work with our pool partners and our reinsurers to say, what is the risk? Tim said this morning that hordes of engineers were crawling over all these shore-based nuclear installations to assess the risks. We're not at that stage yet. I don't think it's going to happen in 12 months, but it would be really helpful if we could start to see some of the detail of what we're talking about. We might unpack some of that, but how big is the exclusion area? What's the safety planning area? Is it contained to the ship? Is it a unit within the ship, or are we talking the whole port? All of these things are fundamentals that are technical, but affect how we go about building the insurance structures. So a long answer, forgive me for that, but I hope that covers where we are.
No, I do forgive you, because I think you've picked up on a theme that has come across several times today, and that is maritime elements of legacy maritime and legacy nuclear need to start talking to each other, because this is a new way of combining the two. And it's good that you're speaking to your counterparts in the nuclear industry, and I'm sure you can start to speak each other's language.
Yeah, our plan by the end of 2027 is to develop some frameworks that could then be considered for a decision. So I think we're doing the thing that I'm saying we ought to do.
Of course you are. Who's got some questions? Oh, hello, Mike. I didn't give you a question earlier. Go on then.
Thanks. It's Mike Salthouse from North Standard, and thanks. An excellent panel. It's not too, Paddy. Don't look quite so worried. Ian, very interesting what you're saying about the bilateral agreement. I'm just wondering whether you feel, or whether you've looked at whether you could actually make provision for third-party claimants within the bilateral agreement. So I suppose you could envisage a situation where you're sailing along the corridor between the UK and the United States, and you have some sort of nuclear incident off the coast of Ireland. You contaminate fish stocks, and there are claims brought by Irish third-party claimants. Is there any way in which you could make provision, and with a sufficient degree of certainty that the claims would be directed towards maybe a fund that's within the bilateral agreement, or do you feel you just think that's not legally possible? I'd be interested in your thoughts. Thanks.
I think you can do it. You can take elements of the existing liability, the fundamental principles of liability, the nuclear liability regime, and put them into the bilateral agreement. So things like the operator being solely responsible, channeling liabilities to the operator. What you can't do, of course, is legally bind a court in Ireland to send a claim to a US or a UK court if that was where the corridor was. What you could do is have a government indemnity or some sort of guarantee that if that did happen and there was a judgment against another party, the government would step in and pay that or meet that liability. So contractually, you could do that. Not been done before, but it's not going to look like something that we've seen before.
And there's ultimately going to be a number of gaps in that. And so I absolutely agree with Ian. The bilateral is a way to start. And it helps you to stress test the system. It helps you to find out where you need to concentrate your efforts, ultimately leading to a multilateral and international agreements. But it's not the end result. It's a starting place, and it helps. But it's not going to cover everything, no matter how hard you try.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Yes, the lady down there.
My question is how the situation with flag states complicates the regulatory issue. I come from Greece. Greece is a big ship-owning nation, of course, but not all vessels who are managed by Greek companies do have the Greek flag. So there is a number of flag states that operate across Europe, the vessels operate across Europe. So how does that complicate the issue between the port authorities, the states that have shipping companies on their premises, but where the vessels do not fly the flag of that country?
They're all looking at me at this point.
If I can have a go. Yeah, have a go.
Oh, we can have a go.
Well, I think part of the answer, at least, is that flag states are going to be severely restricted from where they are now. So, in the US-UK example, for instance, for a shipping corridor, it would be a US or UK flag. You're not going to have a Marshall Island flag of a nuclear ship. So that I think bit is gonna change, and I'm way out of my lane here talking about flags. But the at least to start with, the licensed operator and the flag state are going to be the same state, to keep things simple.
I don't know that you necessarily have to do it that way, but it's the point that I think we've all made is just you do it in the most simple way possible at first, and it makes sense to have the same states involved. And a point that Mikhail made, I think, is that you're not necessarily going to have all of the current flags. They're not necessarily all going to have the appetite for nuclear. So there may be a consolidation around those who have got the desire and the expertise to really provide the level of support that's needed for nuclear. So there'll be a bit of a change in the market.
Yeah,
That's what happens, but that's, I think, achievable.
And let's recall, not every ship is going to be a nuclear ship. There will be still thousands and thousands who aren't. But we will see some quite significant changes, to the way that the ownership structure, the flagging, etc., for certain vessels will be. That will necessarily have to change. Now, if you're a government, why might you think that is a good idea? So, why does the US want to get involved in nuclear-powered ships? Well, it's seen the tonnage on its flag decline very significantly over a long period of time. So is the UK. The UK has almost nothing on its flag now. And I think that is a great loss to great maritime nations. And when you speak to politicians or policymakers, they feel like, if they're a great maritime nation, they want to have maritime dominance, I believe President Trump calls it. Well, you actually need some more ships on your flag. And if supporting nuclear-powered ships by having the right regulatory regime to make them happen gets more ships on your flag, then that is a very positive for a very ambitious nation. But I'm not saying that there won't be Marshall Islands flagships in the future, they just won't be nuclear. Right, who else has a question? The gentleman in the centre here.
Thank you to the panel for the very interesting discussion. And if I may, I've got a technical question for Dr. Hirdaris. During the discussion, there was many mentions of the potential benefits of significant increases in speed of nuclear ships versus conventional merchant ships.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to hear your view on what that is likely to do to the level of cavitation from the propellers and thereby the level of emissions of underwater radiated noise from the ships. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will try to answer your question from a technical perspective and then give a more shipping economics view. At the moment, when you have a full block coefficient ship, so if you have a tanker, if you have a bulk carrier, the speed of the ship in relation to the resistance of the ship in waves is very much related with the principal dimensions of this asset. So there is a fine balance for this to be economically viable, safe, sustainable. There is interest by the international community to explore an alternative transportation model whereby the speed of service is not going to be any longer such a big issue. However, this is achievable up to a point, irrespective to the details of the freight model you may use or some mathematical assumptions, because the resistance of a ship in waves is always limited by the principal dimensions. And if you go to the propulsion aspects, you're going to face cavitation, erosion, and a number of other things that okay, perhaps they could be solved with the right materials, the right technology, but the overall viability of the concept is going to be limited up to a point. So in other words, we are not going to see tanker ships that are going to go 22 knots. We're not going to see that. That's very difficult. The physics do not work. Okay. Now, one of the things to consider then from a techno-economic or transportation perspective that links with some of the questions the other members of the panel they try to answer today is that at the moment shipping works on the basis of internationalization, globalization. But we might have to explore a shipping transportation model where we combine globalization and regionalization. So in other words, you may have big nuclear ships that support the requirements of the economies of scale between different continents, but when you go to different regions of the world, you may have to move some of this cargo to smaller ships that work on more standard technology, green but standard, to move those closer to the ports. This is a slightly different transportation system than the one we have today and is not completely foreign. Something like that could happen with the right infrastructure in place. So this would resolve quite a few of the problems that relate with legalities, insurance, and some of the economics as well.
Thank you, Spyros. Any further questions? I've got a gentleman there waving at me at the back there. Oh, somebody's got a microphone. Somebody stole the microphone. Okay, who's... Off you go.
All right, thank you. Nathaniel Reid, University of Cambridge. The track record of the UK accepting American nuclear technologies is not particularly heartening. The AP1000 GDA took 10 years, and the review contained some choice comments such as that the NRC safety classification system didn't correspond with IAEA basic safety standards. So we like to point to international standards to justify our decisions. Since then, we've had an executive order peeling out ALARA from DOE licensing with an aim to do that in the NRC as well. This was an announcement which caused audible gasps at the annual meeting of the International Commission of Radiological Protection. So, given all that, how confident are you that putting an American technology through the ONR Environment Agency Natural England mangle will result in success or a mobile fish disco or... Yes.
Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll have a go. I mean, it's very difficult to know what the regulatory regime is going to look like at the moment, given the... so for benefit of others, the Fingleton review was mentioned earlier. And basically the main thrust of that was to try and simplify nuclear regulation, streamline it, make it more risk-based and proportionate. And the same sort of language has been used in the US, and I imagine that's where that announcement came from. So there are moves to try and change the way nuclear is regulated, but also try and facilitate more regulatory harmonization between trusted regulators. And I know the ONR are working closely with NRC and CNNC in Canada, for instance, on particular designs. So there are other aspects which have to happen to support this. So there might also be collaborations between regulators, if that's what it looks like, or regulators going on secondment to other countries where these things are licensed or for the first time. But the answer is we don't know, and it is a challenge. So I'm not saying this is going to be easy. I'll pass over to Kimberly.
Kimberly.
I would just say that right now, the nuclear universe is in a completely different place than we were at that time when we were looking at first round reviews of AP1000s. The fact that we're talking about harmonization, standardization, we're looking at joint reviews. Now the discussion is about reliance-based methods of licensing. This is not the world that we were in before. Obviously, national sovereignty remains critical, and it remains absolutely the final end place where the ultimate decision has to be taken by the national regulatory body. But the types of cooperations, the types of joint work that we're seeing, I don't think is comparable to where we were 10 to 15 years ago. Everyone understands that an international approach is needed to have a global market. And the fact that the word enable is being used by regulatory bodies around the world is not something I ever would have heard a year ago. So the world is changing dramatically, and I think that we are in an era where that type of joint work, joint review, and combined assessment will lead us to a better result than perhaps where we were back in the other times of looking at only large light water reactors.
And we're also talking about things like, can technical service organizations travel with a reactor? So they approve it in America. Can they come and bolt onto a regulator here to help support that and get the licensing application through? There's lots of things that can happen to change.
Okay, thank you very much. Look, I'm going to try and do Oscar level of timekeeping here. So I'm going to have to ask my panel for their final thoughts in 30 seconds. So I opened up with setting out the case for nuclear-powered ships for the industry and how they could absolutely transform shipping. And we spent a lot of time, talking about some of the things the challenges that we have to overcome. So I'm going to ask each of you in 30 seconds, are you optimistic? Spyros.
I am as practically possible. I think nuclear shipping has a great potential for the future. It is the ultimate solution in terms of achieving the net zero targets. And the technology can be developed. But in order to get somewhere, we have to pinpoint at this moment in time or over the next period a specific opportunity, a defined corridor, and we have to arrange well the interface between classification and the regulatory authorities. And only in this way we can move from if and whether to when and to how.
Very good, thank you. Ian.
So, I mean, we talk a lot about challenges, especially being lawyers, but I want to end on a bit more of a positive note. Yes, we're working outside an established regulatory regime, but that, as well as being a challenge, that is an opportunity. It means that we can shape the regulatory regime. Yes, there are guardrails we've got to stay within to build that public trust, to reflect the core principles of nuclear regulation, but there is a lot of scope to innovate within those and come up with something that actually enables nuclear ships to go forward whilst maintaining and building that public trust. So I think that we should be positive about the opportunity as well.
Fantastic. Kimberly.
I'll say I'm a cautious optimist. I think you can't work in the nuclear industry without being an optimist. The potentials for the technology are there, and I think all of us, at the end of the day, have a very positive outlook on the work that we're doing, and so that cautious optimism is there. Right now, we're waiting for that key to unlock, and I think that key to unlock is government support. Once governments are on board, once governments say this is something that we want, then the universe is there. We just need to find that way to get governments to say, we're going to put our resources behind this, but right now resources are a huge issue, whether it's financial or human resources, everyone's stretched. But cautious optimism.
Excellent. And finally, Paddy.
I'm optimistic in the sense that I think we insurers need to be ready. I think there is enough enthusiasm, enough business case for it that we're going to be asked the question and we need to make sure that we're ready. Personally, I think that the key question is that of safety. We as insurers talk a lot about the fact that the public take comfort that if something goes wrong, we're standing behind it. When it comes to nuclear, I think the public want to know that we're not going to be called on, that it is fundamentally safe. But I think there are gaps in all the frameworks that the lawyers are putting together, and that's where governments will have a role. And along with picking the easy option for the first things, it's about picking those things that are clearly in the national interest, so that the first movers get government support and that governments are willing to, frankly, put taxpayers' money behind it because it's in the national interest.
That's fantastic. So we've got 3 optimists and Spyros.
Oh, don't say that. I'm optimistic.
Yes.
Yeah, it's Alan Burges. This question, if we are optimistic whether it will happen, this is just a question of do we actually believe or want to make nuclear shipping the property somehow as the free quarters. This will happen in China. They see that this is profitable. Whatever we do here, unless we do it first, they own the farmers around in Africa and South Asia. When they see that if they do this and can run a more profitable operation than we can, of course, the African nation where they have this harbor will not protest when China says that we will operate the nuclear power ships here are rules that we can translate for you to your language and you can stamp it. They will not object to this, and this will happen. So we can just decide, do we want to stay there or at least on point, or let China do it?
Thank you. That's a very, very valid point, and we haven't really got into the sort of geopolitical discussion and debate, but clearly there are reasons why the US is very interested, is because clearly the Chinese are definitely A, huge shipbuilders, and B, they are doing an awful lot in this space, and therefore it does become a capability, a sovereign capability that certain nations will want to have. Right. Thank you to my panel.